Hi there, John Wilkinson and History Made Easier. This video is going to take a look at Lenin's domestic policies, and it's going to ask the question of just how far those policies were pragmatic, essentially with a mind to holding on to power, and how far those policies were in fact ideologically based. If we look at some past exam questions, and I have some up here on my computer, we can see where this way into looking at Lenin's domestic policies can pay off for you in the exam. Here's a question from the November 2018 exam paper. Social and economic policies in authoritarian states did not always achieve their aims. Discuss with reference to one authoritarian state. Well, their aims, were they essentially about holding on to power, or were those aims about imposing, bringing about a socialist economy, a socialist society? And another question, again from the November series, this time 2019. Evaluate the impact of domestic economic policies on the maintenance of power in two authoritarian states, each from a different region. So you can see how this video might be of practical, pragmatic use to you in your exam. So let's take a look at Lenin's policies, or some of them at least. Well, if we begin with the more pragmatic, let's make sure we hold on to power policies, I would begin with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, bitterly debated within the Bolshevik Party itself, and Lenin had to fight really hard to push it through. But Lenin was adamant that unless the Bolsheviks brought about peace, no matter the cost, then they would go the same way as the Tsar and the same way as the provisional government. They would be condemned to the dustbin of history. Then we have, I think, the Declaration of Rights of the Peoples of Russia. The Bolsheviks' Lenin-driven response to the nationalist issue. And again, Lenin had a fight on his hands. Stalin wasn't entirely happy with the policy that came out. But Lenin took the view that unless we show a willingness to free the peripheral states, the likes of the Ukraine, for example, then they will run away from us. They won't want anything to do with us. In a sense, it was a bit of a gamble. That by giving them the option of joining with the emerging Soviet Union, then they would be prepared to do that. Whereas if it was imposed on them, they would have civil wars on the peripheral areas of the Soviet Union on their hands. And so they went for this voluntary and honourable union, as they put it. And the gamble was also kind of made more palatable to the Bolsheviks by the belief at that point that revolutions elsewhere in Europe would, if those states had seceded from the emerging Soviet Union, then revolutions elsewhere in Europe would bring them back into the fold. So it was really, I think, a pragmatic policy because they knew they couldn't deal with any wars in those peripheral states, any civil wars essentially in those peripheral states, or wars of independence, depending on how you want to look at that. And then the other policy that I would highlight as far as holding on to power is concerned is, of course, the NEP, the response to war communism and the rejection of continuing with war communism once the Russian Civil War was over. Lenin realized that they had to take that step backwards in order to take bigger steps forward. And so he accepted the need for essentially a mixed economy, part socialist, part capitalist. And that, I think, gives you plenty of ammunition there to write about pragmatic policies really aimed at the maintenance of power. As for ideologically founded policies, I think really there's still a debate there to be had as to just how far these were driven, in fact, by the Bolsheviks and how far they were driven by the people on the ground. We can begin with what became Bolshevik official policy, looting the looters, when in the countryside the manor houses were being invaded and property stolen from them, as well as the land itself, of course. And in the towns, the homes of the wealthy, the homes of the bourgeoisie, were being occupied and taken over by workers. Factories being taken over by workers and factory committees set up. This was happening on the ground. Really, the Bolsheviks responded by making it official policy. And so we have the decree on the separation of church and state, for example, that made church lands state property. We have the land decree that really just legalized what was happening anyway with the seizure of land by the peasants themselves. We have the decree on the workplace that really legitimized what was happening when workers were taking over the factories themselves and setting up their own management committees. And as I said, we end up with this kind of state capitalism where really only the big landed estates and those church estates were owned by the state, were nationalized. And only the big industrial concerns were nationalized. The banks were nationalized too. But smaller businesses, the small plots of land that the peasantry had already organized to divide amongst themselves, that remained really in private hands. And so even where we have ideologically driven policies, we can see that not always and not entirely were they driven by the Bolsheviks themselves. So I hope that was useful for you, and I hope it would help you with that kind of question that you might face in your exam. As always, I thank you for listening, and as always, I remind you to check out my History Made Easier website and get in touch with me if there's anything you want me to add to that site to help you with your studies. But for now, Cheers.